"Evelyn," my father commanded, stepping out of my private elevator without an invitation. "Tell the boy to come out here. We need his signature on these trust documents immediately." My mother followed him, throwing a check for $10,000 onto my marble coffee table. I looked calmly at the two people who had thrown me out of their house in the middle of a blizzard when I was 17 and pregnant. "You do not want a grandson," I replied, my voice as cold as the Manhattan skyline outside my window. "You want a bailout, and unfortunately for you, my company bought your mortgage this morning. My name is Evelyn Cross. I am a 33-year-old single mother and the CEO of a corporate asset liquidation firm. And to understand how my parents went from demanding my son's signature to begging on their knees in my penthouse, you have to understand what happens when a scapegoat finally stops crying and starts auditing." It was a quiet Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the massive, custom-built marble island in my kitchen, sipping a black espresso and reviewing a digital portfolio of distressed commercial real estate assets. My penthouse, perched on the 42nd floor, offered a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. It was silent, secure, and impenetrable. Or so I thought. At exactly 9 a.m., the soft melodic chime of my private elevator echoed through the foyer. I frowned, setting my iPad down. My 14-year-old son, Noah, was in the library finishing his advanced calculus homework, and I wasn't expecting any deliveries. The heavy steel doors slid open. Stepping into my foyer were two ghosts from a life I had buried over a decade ago: Grant and Meredith Ellison. My parents. My father was 61, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that looked expensive from a distance, but slightly frayed upon closer inspection. He carried himself with the stiff, arrogant posture of an old money patriarch who believed the world existed solely to cater to his ego. My mother, Meredith, was 59. She was draped in a cashmere coat, her hair perfectly blown out, clutching a leather tote bag. Her face was pulled tight into a mask of perpetual disdain. They did not look around in awe at the sheer scale of the penthouse. They did not look apologetic. They marched into my home with the terrifying entitlement of people who believed they still owned me. "Evelyn," my father commanded, not bothering with a greeting, striding directly into the living room. "Where is the boy? Tell him to come out here. We don't have time for a reunion. We need his signature on these trust documents immediately." My heart hammered against my ribs, an ancient instinctual trauma response flaring to life. 14 years of total silence, and their first words to me were a demand. I didn't stand up. I simply swiveled my bar stool to face them, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "Good morning, Grant." "Meredith," I said, my voice eerily calm. "How did you bypass my building security?" "Sloane's husband, Marcus, is waiting in the lobby," my mother said impatiently, dropping her cashmere coat onto my custom velvet sofa as if she owned the place. "He works for the auditing firm that handles the commercial leases for this building. He had the concierge override the elevator protocol. Now, stop playing the difficult daughter. Call the boy." Sloane was my older sister, the 36-year-old golden child who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate her own status. I looked at my parents. They were standing in my home, demanding access to a son they had never met, to secure a signature for a trust fund they clearly needed. "You haven't seen me in 14 years, I stated, leaning my elbows on the marble counter. "And you break into my home to demand a signature from a child you threw into the street before he was even born. Why?" My father sighed heavily, rolling his eyes as if my trauma was simply an annoying administrative hurdle he had to clear. "Your grandfather Theodore passed away last week," Grant announced bluntly. I felt a sharp, sudden pang of genuine grief. My grandfather, Theodore Ellison, had been a brilliant retired appellate judge. He was a hard, strict man, but he was the only person in the Ellison family who possessed a moral compass. When I was kicked out, my parents had told Theodore that I ran away, and later that my baby had died during birth. "He've left a massive estate trust," my father continued, pulling a thick legal envelope from his breast pocket. "But his lawyers informed us yesterday that the primary liquidity of the trust is locked." Theodore added an addendum to the will shortly before his death. The trust requires a verified DNA swab and a physical signature from your son, Noah, to release the principal funds to me and your mother as the executors." He knew, I whispered to myself, a slow smile forming on my lips. My grandfather was a judge. He was suspicious by nature. He hadn't believed their lies about Noah dying. He had locked his fortune behind the one person my parents had tried to erase. He had set a legal trap from beyond the grave to force them to acknowledge my son's existence. "It's a ridiculous bureaucratic nightmare," Meredith snapped, walking over to the marble island. She reached into her tote bag, pulled out a checkbook, and aggressively scribbled a signature. She ripped the check out and slammed it onto the counter in front of me. "Here," my mother said, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. $10,000. I'm sure that's more money than you've ever seen at one time in your life. Take it. Buy the boy some decent clothes and bring him out here to sign the paperwork so we can all move on with our lives." I looked down at the check. They truly believed I was still the terrified, penniless, 17-year-old girl they had discarded. Because I had completely severed ties and blocked their entire social circle, they had no idea who I had become. They had no idea that I owned the penthouse they were standing in. They assumed I was renting it, probably funded by child support or a wealthy boyfriend. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the check back at her. As the CEO of Apex Dominion Recovery, my entire career was built on evaluating distressed assets, analyzing debt portfolios, and liquidating bankrupt entities. I was trained to look at the numbers behind the narrative. I picked up the $10,000 check and looked at the routing number printed at the bottom. It wasn't a standard checking account routing number for a high net worth individual. I recognized the banking institution immediately. It was a secondary, high-risk lender that specialized in short-term, predatory cash advances against real estate equity. I slowly set the check back down on the marble counter. I looked at the slight fraying on my father's suit cuffs. I looked at the slight panic hidden behind my mother's aggressive posture. "This check isn't drawn from a savings account, Meredith," I said softly, my voice slicing through their arrogance like a scalpel. "This routing number belongs to a high-yield equity credit line. You took a cash advance at an 18% interest rate just to write this." My mother froze. Her hand tightened around the handle of her leather tote bag. "Excuse me," Grant demanded, his face flushing red. "You don't have $10,000 in cash," I stated, leaning forward, pinning my father with an icy, analytical stare. "You are leveraging high-interest debt to bribe me. Which means your liquidity is gone. Which means you didn't come here because you suddenly respect my son's legal rights." I picked up the check and tore it precisely in half. "You do not want a grandson," I told them, dropping the torn pieces onto the counter. "You want a bailout." "How dare you speak to us like that?" Meredith shrieked, the mask of the sophisticated country club wife slipping entirely. "We are your parents. We gave you a beautiful life, and you ruined it. You brought shame to this family, and now you are trying to hold your grandfather's money hostage." The word shame echoed in my mind, triggering the vivid, terrifying memory of the night my life changed forever. It was Valentine's Day 14 years ago. I was 17 years old, a junior in high school, standing in the massive foyer of my parents' sprawling Connecticut estate. The snow was falling in heavy, blinding sheets outside the grand double doors. I was 6 months pregnant. I had hidden the pregnancy under oversized sweaters for as long as I could, terrified of the consequences. But that night, my mother had found the prenatal vitamins hidden in the back of my bathroom drawer. The confrontation wasn't a tearful family discussion. It was an execution. "You disgusting little whore," my mother had hissed, grabbing a heavy garbage bag and violently shoving my clothes into it. "You are not going to humiliate us. You are not going to ruin Sloane's debutante season with a bastard child." My father hadn't even looked at me. He had stood by the front door, wearing his expensive cashmere sweater, watching his pregnant teenage daughter weep hysterically on the hardwood floor. "Get out," Grant had said, his voice completely devoid of paternal warmth. "You are no longer an Ellison. You will not see a dime of your college fund. You are dead to us." My older sister, Sloane, who was 22 at the time, had stood on the grand staircase, watching the scene unfold with a smug, satisfied smile. I was the competition, and I had just eliminated myself. They opened the heavy oak front doors. The freezing, biting wind howled into the foyer. My mother grabbed the collar of my coat, dragged me to the threshold, and shoved me out into the blizzard. She threw the black garbage bag of clothes after me. "Do not ever come back," she screamed over the wind. And then they slammed the door. I had slept in a 24-hour laundromat that night, curled up on a hard plastic chair, my hands wrapped protectively around my swollen belly, shaking from the cold and the sheer terror of absolute abandonment. I survived. I clawed my way through community college while working 2 jobs, raising Noah in a tiny, moldy apartment. I transferred to a state university, got a degree in finance, and discovered I had a ruthless, brilliant mind for understanding debt structures. I built a career tearing down failing corporations, and eventually, I founded my own firm. I didn't survive because of them. I survived in spite of them, and now they were standing in my living room, demanding access to the child they had thrown into the snow. "I didn't ruin my life," I said, pulling myself back to the present, looking at my parents with a calm, terrifying clarity. "I built an empire out of the wreckage you left me in. And I am not giving you my son's signature so you can pay off your credit cards. Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat." Grant snarled, taking a threatening step toward the kitchen island. He raised his hand, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You will call that boy out here right now. You do not have a choice. I am the executor of that trust, and I will have you dragged into court for obstructing a legal estate proceeding." Before I could reply, the soft chime of the private elevator rang out again. The steel doors slid open. Stepping into my foyer was my older sister, Sloane. She was 36, wearing an expensive, camel-colored trench coat and clutching a bright orange Hermes Birkin bag like a shield. She looked exactly as she had 14 years ago, arrogant, deeply entitled, and completely convinced of her own superiority. Standing quietly behind her was her husband, Marcus Reed. He was 38, wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit. As the director of a massive financial auditing firm, Marcus was a man who lived his life entirely in spreadsheets and data. He didn't speak. He simply stood in the background, watching the scene unfold with sharp, analytical eyes. Sloane marched into the living room, her high heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. She looked around the penthouse, her nose wrinkling in manufactured disgust. "Nice rental, Evelyn?" Sloane scoffed, dripping with condescension. "Who's paying for it? One of your sleazy collection agency clients." "Hello, Sloane," I said smoothly. "I see you brought your husband to hack my elevator. Marcus handles the commercial audits for the management company that owns this building," Sloane said proudly, waving her hand. "We don't wait in lobbies. Now, Mom and Dad have been more than generous offering you $10,000. Take the money, get the kid's signature, and let us leave. We have a meeting with the estate attorneys at 2 o'clock. "The answer is no," I said. Sloane's eyes narrowed. The smug superiority vanished, replaced by the vicious, bullying tactic she had always used when I didn't comply with the family narrative. "Don't play games with me, Evelyn," Sloane threatened, stepping closer to the marble island, slamming her Birkin bag down on the counter. "I know how the system works. You are a single mother. You work long hours. You live in a high-rise. I can make one phone call to Child Protective Services right now and report that you are neglecting a minor. I can tell them you are emotionally unstable and hoarding a child to extort our family." The room went dead silent. My mother smirked. My father crossed his arms, clearly approving of Sloane's nuclear option. They thought they had me trapped. They thought that by threatening to take Noah away, they would trigger the terrified protective panic of a single mother. But I didn't panic. I looked at Sloane. I looked at the Birkin bag on the counter. And then I reached into my pocket, pulled out my sleek black smartphone, and unlocked the screen. I slid the phone across the smooth marble counter. It stopped exactly 1 inch from Sloane's manicured fingers. The screen was open to the dial pad. The numbers 18004ACHILD were already typed in. Make the call, Sloane, I said softly. Sloane stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The 11 digits for Child Protective Services were queued up, waiting for her to press the green call button. She had expected me to flinch. She had expected me to beg, to negotiate, to do whatever it took to keep the state away from my son. In our family dynamics, Sloane's threats were always treated as absolute law. But I didn't flinch. I just watched her. Make the call, Sloane, I repeated, my voice dropping to a low conversational volume that was infinitely more terrifying than a scream. Press the button. Tell the state operator that you are standing in a luxury Manhattan penthouse and that you believe a 14-year-old boy is in imminent danger because his mother refuses to let him sign a multi-million-dollar financial document. Sloane swallowed hard. Her manicured finger hovered over the phone, trembling slightly. Do you know what happens when you initiate a CPS investigation during a contested estate proceeding? I asked, stepping around the marble island, closing the distance between us. The state doesn't just investigate the mother. They investigate the entire family structure. They will pull my financial records, which are immaculate. And then, they will pull Grant and Meredith's financial records, since they are the ones demanding custody of the child's signature. My father's face suddenly went pale. They will discover the high-interest cash advance Meredith used to write that bounce check, I continued, my eyes never leaving Sloane's. They will discover the overdue mortgage on the Connecticut house. They will discover your father's abysmal credit score. And when they realize that you weaponized a child abuse hotline to extort a financial signature from a minor, the state will open a criminal investigation against you for filing a malicious false report. I tapped the glass screen of the phone with my index finger. So call them, Sloane. Let's get the state involved. I have a team of corporate lawyers on retainer who would absolutely love to depose you under oath. Sloane pulled her hand back, as if the phone was physically burning her. She looked at her father, waiting for him to step in and save her, waiting for him to assert his patriarchal dominance and put me back in my place. Grant cleared his throat nervously, adjusting the lapels of his fraying suit. There's no need for dramatic threats, Grant said, his voice losing a significant amount of its previous bluster. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. We didn't come here to argue, Evelyn. We came here to execute Theodore's final wishes. I am the executor of this will, and the law is the law. He unfolded the document and smoothed it out on the marble counter. Your grandfather was very specific, Grant explained, tapping a heavily bolded paragraph near the bottom of the second page. The primary trust, which contains over $12 million in liquid assets, is locked. Theodore added a stipulation 3 years ago. The funds cannot be released to me or your mother until a verified DNA swab from your son is submitted to the estate attorneys, alongside his physical signature acknowledging his status as an heir. I looked down at the document. The legal jargon was dense, but the implication was glaringly obvious. I looked up at my father, tilting my head slightly. Theodore was an appellate judge, I said slowly. He was a man who lived his entire life adhering to the strictest interpretations of evidence and logic. Tell me, Grant, why would a brilliant, skeptical judge demand living? Biological proof of a child that you told him died 14 years ago. The silence in the penthouse was sudden and absolute. Meredith looked away, suddenly intensely interested in the panoramic view of the city. Sloane looked down at her Birkin bag. Even Marcus, standing silently in the background, shifted his weight, his eyes locked onto my father. I don't know what you're talking about, Grant stammered, his face flushing a deep, guilty crimson. Theodore was getting old. His mind was slipping in the last few years. He was paranoid. My grandfather's mind was a steel trap until the day his heart stopped. I corrected him sharply. When you threw me out in the blizzard, you had a problem. Theodore loved me. If he found out you kicked a pregnant 17-year-old into the street to protect your country club reputation, he would have disinherited you immediately. So, what narrative did you feed him? Grant refused to answer. He stared at the marble counter, his jaw clenched tight. I can tell you exactly what you told him, I said, leaning in. Because my corporate investigators pulled Theodore's banking records from the last decade. You told him that I ran away in the middle of the night. You told him that my baby died during a botched delivery in a shady clinic. And then, a few years later, when Theodore kept asking where I was, you told him I had gone missing in Mexico. Meredith let out a small, strangled gasp. And the best part, I continued, the disgust rising in my throat, you used my disappearance as a revenue stream. You convinced Theodore to fund a massive, ongoing search effort. You pulled hundreds of thousands of dollars out of his personal accounts over the last 10 years, claiming you were hiring private investigators and funding rescue missions across the border. You milked a grieving old man by pretending to search for the daughter you intentionally threw away. Grant slammed his hand down on the counter, the loud crack echoing through the penthouse. It was his money, Grant yelled, dropping the facade entirely, his face twisted with desperate rage. He had millions sitting in offshore accounts, doing nothing. We needed the capital to maintain the estate. You ruined this family's reputation, Evelyn. You owed us that money for the shame you brought upon us. I didn't bring shame to this family, I replied, my voice dangerously soft. You brought fraud to it. I tapped the fake will sitting on the counter. Theodore wasn't paranoid, Grant, I said. He was suspicious. He realized you were lying about the private investigators. He realized my son wasn't dead. And so he set a trap. He locked the trust behind the one person you spent 14 years trying to erase. He didn't write this stipulation to reward you. He wrote it to force you to admit what you did to me. It doesn't matter why he wrote it, Meredith shrieked, her patience completely snapping. The money is locked. We are losing the house, Evelyn. The bank is threatening foreclosure. We need that signature today, or we are going to be living on the street. Where is the boy? Bring him out here right now. Are you referring to me? A calm, clear voice asked. Everyone turned. Standing in the arched doorway of the hallway was my son, Noah. He was 14 years old, tall for his age, with dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He was wearing his private academy uniform, a crisp white button-down shirt, a navy blue blazer, and a neatly tied tie. He held a sleek silver iPad in his left hand. He did not look like a scared, neglected teenager. He looked like a junior executive walking into a hostile boardroom. Meredith's eyes widened. For a split second, the sheer biological reality of seeing her grandson, the child she had tried to dispose of in a garbage bag 14 years ago, seemed to physically shock her. She took a hesitant step forward, a fake, trembling smile spreading across her face. Oh my goodness, Meredith cooed, raising her hands as if to embrace him, perfectly slipping back into the role of the loving, wealthy grandmother. Noah, is that you? Look how handsome you are. You look just like your grandfather, Theodore. Come here, sweetheart. Give your grandmother a hug. Noah didn't move. He looked at her raised arms, and then he looked directly into her eyes. Please do not touch me, Noah said. His voice wasn't angry. It was polite, firm, and completely devoid of any emotional connection. Meredith froze, her arms dropping to her sides, her fake smile shattering into a look of deep, profound offense. Evelyn, Grant barked, turning to me. Tell your son to show some respect. We are his grandparents. Respect is a highly illiquid asset in this room, Grant, I replied calmly. And he doesn't take orders from you. Neither do I. Grant turned back to Noah. He realized the emotional approach wasn't going to work. So, he pivoted to the only language he actually understood: bribery. He plastered a wide, charismatic smile onto his face and walked a few steps closer to the boy. Noah, listen to me, Grant said, using his best salesman voice. I know this is a lot to process. Your mother probably told you a lot of terrible things about us, but we are here to make things right. You see this document? Your great-grandfather left us a massive fortune, over $12 million, but the lawyers made a silly mistake, and they need your signature to fix it. Grant spread his arms wide, gesturing to the luxurious penthouse around them. If you sign this paper right now, Grant promised, his voice dripping with honey, I will make sure you are taken care of for the rest of your life. Do you like cars, Noah? I can buy you an Aston Martin the day you get your license. I can buy you a summer house in the Hamptons. I can give you a black credit card with no limit. All you have to do is write your name on the dotted line, and we can be a real, wealthy family again. It was a pitch designed to overwhelm a normal 14-year-old boy. Cars, money, mansions, endless credit. Noah stood perfectly still. He didn't look excited. He didn't look tempted. He looked at my father the way a seasoned auditor looks at a fraudulent tax return. "An Aston Martin?" Noah asked, tilting his head slightly. "Brand new," Grant beamed, thinking he had hooked the boy. "Any color you want." "That's a very generous offer," Noah said smoothly. "But I have a question regarding the fundamental liquidity of the trust structure." Grant's smile faltered slightly. The what?" "The liquidity," Noah repeated, taking a step into the living room, his iPad glowing softly in his hand. "You stated that the trust contains $12 million in liquid assets. However, if you are the named executor, your fiduciary duty requires you to distribute the assets according to the explicit terms of the will. If the will requires my biological verification to release the funds, it implies that the primary beneficiary of those funds is, in fact, me, not you." Grant stared at the 14-year-old boy, completely blindsided by the legal vocabulary. "Now listen here, son," Grant started. "Furthermore," Noah continued, cutting his grandfather off with absolute authority, "if I am the primary beneficiary, and you are merely the executor, then offering to buy me a car using my own money is not a gift. It is a gross violation of your fiduciary responsibility and constitutes direct financial coercion." Sloane's mouth dropped open. Meredith looked like she was going to faint. Noah walked over to the marble island and stood next to me. He placed his iPad on the counter, next to the torn pieces of the $10,000 check. "But the legal semantics don't really matter," Noah said, looking up at his grandfather with a cold, piercing gaze. "Because the premise of your bribe is structurally flawed. You cannot buy me an Aston Martin, Grant. You cannot buy me a summer house in the Hamptons. You certainly cannot offer me a black credit card. And why the hell not?" Grant demanded, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Noah tapped the screen of his iPad. "Let us look at your actual financial standing," Noah said, his voice ringing clearly through the penthouse. "Noah, what are you doing?" Sloane snapped, taking a step forward. "You're just a kid. Stop acting like a lawyer." "I am not acting like a lawyer," Noah replied, pulling up a deeply detailed spreadsheet. "I am reading the forensic audit my mother's firm compiled over the last 3 months." Grant's eyes widened in sheer panic. He looked at me, realizing for the first time that my refusal wasn't just stubbornness. It was calculated, weaponized intelligence. "Your current FICO credit score is 512. Noah read aloud from the screen, his tone as detached as a news anchor reading the weather. "You are 6 months delinquent on the primary mortgage for your Connecticut estate. Your debt-to-income ratio is currently sitting at an unsustainable 85%. You have maxed out 6 different high-yield credit cards, and you recently took out a predatory cash advance just to secure the $10,000 check my mother just tore in half." "Shut up!" Meredith screamed, slapping her hands over her ears as if the financial truths were physically burning her. "Evelyn, make him stop. This is private information." "But the most alarming liability," Noah continued, completely ignoring his grandmother's shrieking, "is your transportation. You lease 2 luxury vehicles. You are 4 payments behind on both. According to the recovery database, the repossession orders were issued last Tuesday. You are currently parking them in a public lot 3 miles from your house, so the repo men cannot find them in your driveway." The absolute silence that followed Noah's presentation was deafening. The illusion of the old money, wealthy, untouchable Ellison family had been completely shattered. They weren't aristocrats. They were desperate, drowning debtors running a pathetic shell game to avoid homelessness. Grant stood in the center of the living room, his chest heaving, his face a mask of total, unadulterated humiliation. His 14-year-old grandson, the boy he had tried to erase from existence, had just dismantled his entire life's work using a spreadsheet. He couldn't argue with the data. He couldn't scream at the boy without looking unhinged. So he turned his wrath toward the only person in the room he thought he still controlled. Grant spun around and pointed a shaking finger at Marcus, Sloane's husband, who was still standing quietly by the elevator. Marcus, Grant barked, desperately trying to reclaim his authority. You are the director of a major auditing firm. Tell this insolent child that his data is garbage. Tell Evelyn that these spreadsheets are fabricated nonsense. Defend your family. It was the ultimate test of loyalty. Grant was demanding that the wealthy son-in-law step forward, use his professional credentials, and crush the single mother and her teenage son back into submission. Marcus slowly took his hands out of his pockets. He walked forward, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the hardwood floor. He didn't look at Grant. He didn't look at Sloane. He walked directly up to the marble island, stopped next to me, and reached inside his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He gently placed it on the counter, right next to Noah's iPad. The data is perfectly accurate, Grant, Marcus said, his voice calm, deep, and resonant. I know this for a fact, because I am the one who compiled the audit. Sloane gasped loudly, taking a stumbling step backward. Marcus, what are you talking about? What audit? Marcus finally turned to look at his wife. The look in his eyes was not anger. It was the absolute, crushing disappointment of a man who had spent a decade being used as an ATM by a family of narcissistic parasites. 3 months ago, Evelyn contacted my firm to request a comprehensive forensic analysis of the Ellison family assets. Marcus explains to me, his voice echoing through the stunned silence of the penthouse. Since my firm handles the commercial leases for this building, her request crossed my desk. When I saw the name, I decided to handle the audit personally. You spied on us? Grant stammered, his mind unable to process the betrayal. You work for us. You are part of this family. I work for the truth, Marcus corrected him coldly. And the truth is, Grant, you are financially insolvent. You have been stealing from Theodore's accounts for years. And you, Marcus turned his gaze to Sloane, have been using my money to fund your parents' failing lifestyle while racking up massive, hidden debts of your own. Sloane's face drained of color. She clutched her Birkin bag to her chest like a life preserver. Marcus, please, Sloane whispered, her voice trembling. Don't do this here. Let's go home. We can talk about this at home. We don't have a home anymore, Sloane, Marcus said softly. He reached into the leather portfolio on the counter and pulled out a second document. He slid it across the marble toward his wife. What is that? Sloane asked, her voice cracking. That is a formal notice of divorce, Marcus stated. I have frozen all of our joint accounts. I have canceled the secondary credit cards attached to my name, and I have packed your belongings and placed them in a storage unit. The lease on our townhouse is in my name, and the locks were changed this morning. Sloane let out a loud, terrifying wail. She dropped to her knees right there in my living room, sobbing hysterically, begging Marcus to reconsider, begging him to forgive her, completely abandoning the arrogant, superior persona she had worn into my home just 20 minutes prior. Meredith fell to the floor next to her golden child, wrapping her arms around Sloane, screaming at Marcus for destroying her daughter's life. Grant stood frozen, watching the two women weep on the hardwood floor. His financial savior, the wealthy son-in-law he had bragged about at the country club for a decade, had just publicly defected and executed his daughter's marriage. You planned this, Grant whispered, turning his horrified gaze back to me. You set this up. You wanted to destroy us. I didn't destroy anything, Grant, I said calmly, picking up the thick legal envelope my father had brought with him. You destroyed yourselves. I simply documented the structural failure. I held up the fake will he had placed on the counter. This document you brought me? I asked, my voice ringing with absolute authority. The one demanding my son's signature. It's a brilliant piece of legal maneuvering, but it's completely worthless. It is the final will and testament of Theodore Ellison, Grant yelled desperately. Signed and notarized. It was the final will, I corrected him. Until 2.5 years ago. I reached into Marcus's leather portfolio and pulled out a heavy, blue-backed legal document adorned with a massive gold notary seal. 2.5 years ago, my grandfather hired a real private investigator, I revealed, holding the true will up for them to see. Not the fake ones you were billing him for. He found me. He found Noah. And he drove to Manhattan to meet the great-grandson you told him was dead. Grant's knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the back of the velvet sofa to keep from collapsing. He saw the life I had built, I continued, the memory of my grandfather's proud, tear-filled smile warming my chest. And he realized exactly what you had done, so he drafted a new will, a real one. He didn't lock the trust, Grant. He completely rerouted it. I slammed the true will down onto the marble counter. Theodore Ellison left his entire $12 million estate to my son Noah, to be placed in an irrevocable trust under my sole management until his 25th birthday. I stated, delivering the final fatal legal blow. You are not the executor, Grant. You are explicitly, permanently disinherited. You get absolutely nothing. The heavy, blue-backed legal document sat on the marble counter like an unexploded bomb. Grant stared at the true will, his mouth opening and closing silently. His hands, which had pointed at me with such arrogant authority just 30 minutes ago, were now visibly shaking. He reached out and traced the raised gold seal of the notary, as if hoping the document would dissolve under his touch. It didn't. The reality of his complete financial execution was absolute. He knew, Meredith whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring silence in the penthouse. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. Theodore knew about the garbage bag? He knew about the blizzard? He knew everything, I confirmed coldly. When he found me, he asked why I hadn't come to him for help. I told him the truth. I told him that you had threatened to report me to the police for stealing if I tried to contact him. I told him how you drove me to the edge of the property line and locked the gates so I couldn't get back in. I watched the color drain completely from my mother's face. Theodore didn't confront you, I explained, relishing the look of absolute defeat on their faces, because he wanted to see how deep your lies would go. He let you keep submitting those fake invoices for private investigators. He let you dig your own grave. The will you brought today was a decoy. It was designed to force you out of hiding, to force you to come directly to me, completely exposing your desperate financial position. This is illegal. Grant finally managed to choke out, taking a stumbling step backward. You manipulated a dying old man. You brainwashed him into giving you the estate. I will contest this in court. I will tie this trust up in probate for the next 10 years. You can't afford to tie it up for 10 days, Grant. Marcus interjected, speaking with the cold authority of an auditor closing a file. Your accounts are empty. You have zero liquidity to hire a probate attorney. And even if you did, the true will contains an ironclad no contest clause. If you challenge it and lose, you are liable for all legal fees incurred by the estate. Fees you cannot pay. We are your family, Grant suddenly roared, the last pathetic vestiges of his patriarchal control snapping completely. He slammed both hands onto the marble counter. You cannot do this to us, Evelyn. We raised you. We paid for your food, your clothes, the roof over your head. You owe us. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a single, folded piece of thick, ivory-colored paper. Speaking of the roof over your head, I said softly, sliding the paper across the counter until it rested right next to the torn $10,000 check. Grant looked down at the paper. He didn't touch it. He seemed to sense that this was the final, fatal blow. What is that? Meredith asked, her voice trembling violently. For the last 3 years, I began, folding my hands in front of me. My company, Apex Dominion Recovery, has been quietly purchasing portfolios of distressed residential debt from secondary lenders. We buy bad mortgages for pennies on the dollar, and then we either restructure the debt or execute the foreclosure. Grant's eyes snapped up to meet mine. The absolute, unadulterated terror in his gaze was intoxicating. 6 months ago, I continued, I noticed a very specific asset pop up in a distressed debt portfolio. It was a sprawling, 8-bedroom estate in Connecticut. The owners were severely delinquent, having missed 4 consecutive payments. The bank was preparing to sell the debt to a collection agency. No, Grant whispered, shaking his head. No, you didn't. I bought it, I stated, my voice ringing with total, uncompromising power. I bought the paper on your house, Grant. I am your primary creditor." Meredith let out a sharp, hysterical sob and covered her mouth with both hands. "And because you failed to meet the restructuring terms," I said, tapping the ivory paper. "The foreclosure process was finalized at 8 a.m. this morning. The property no longer belongs to you. It belongs to my firm." Grant slowly reached out and opened the folded paper. It was a certified copy of the notice of eviction and foreclosure. "The local sheriff has already posted the notice on your front door," I informed them. "Your neighbors in the country club have already seen it. The Homeowners Association has been notified. You have exactly 48 hours to remove your personal belongings from the premises before my contractors arrive, to change the locks and prepare the asset for liquidation." Grant Ellison, the man who had stood in a cashmere sweater and watched me cry in the snow, the man who had prioritized his social status over the life of his unborn grandson, slowly sank to his knees. He didn't kneel to beg. He knelt because his legs could no longer support the crushing weight of his absolute ruin. "You are making us homeless," Grant choked out, staring at the marble floor of my penthouse. I looked down at him. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. I didn't feel a shred of the daughterly obligation he had spent 17 years trying to program into me. "I am simply returning a favor," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as the winter wind 14 years ago. "Consider it a late Valentine's Day gift." The moment the reality of their homelessness set in, the illusion of their perfect family completely evaporated. Without money to bond them together, the toxic dynamic violently collapsed inward. They began to eat each other alive. "This is your fault," Grant suddenly screamed, pointing a shaking finger up at Meredith. "I told you to stop spending. I told you we couldn't afford the country club dues. But no, you had to keep throwing those ridiculous charity luncheons to impress women who don't even like you. You bled our accounts dry." "Me?" Meredith shrieked, her face twisting into an ugly mask of rage. "You are the one who invested $2 million in that fraudulent real estate scheme in Florida. You lost our retirement fund because you thought you were smarter than everyone else. And then you started stealing from your own father to cover it up. Don't you dare blame my luncheons for your gross incompetence." "Both of you shut up," Sloane wailed, her tear-streaked face rising from the floor. She pointed accusingly at her parents. "You dragged me into this. You told me to use Marcus's credit cards to pay your property taxes. You told me he wouldn't notice. You made me a criminal to protect your stupid house. And now I'm losing my husband." "Oh, don't play the victim, Sloane," Meredith snapped back viciously, turning on her golden child without a second thought. "You were more than happy to use your father's stolen money to buy your fake designer bags. You loved playing the rich housewife. You're just as guilty as we are." Noah watched his grandparents and his aunt scream at each other on the floor of our living room. He didn't look scared. He looked deeply analytical, like a scientist observing a particularly vicious breed of bacteria under a microscope. He looked up at me, raising one eyebrow. Their structural cohesion was entirely dependent on artificial liquidity, Noah noted quietly. "A textbook house of cards," I agreed softly. Marcus stepped forward, stepping over Sloane's discarded Birkin bag. He looked down at the woman he had been married to for 6 years. "Sloane," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the screaming match. Sloane stopped yelling at her mother and looked up at Marcus, her eyes wide with desperate, frantic hope. She scrambled to her feet, wiping the mascara from her cheeks, trying to piece her shattered dignity back together. "Marcus, please," Sloane begged, reaching out to grab his suit jacket. I'm so sorry. They manipulated me. You know how they are. They used my anxiety against me. Please don't leave me. We can fix this. I'll go to therapy. I'll get a job. Just don't freeze my accounts." "I have nowhere to go." Marcus gently but firmly removed her hands from his jacket. "You aren't sorry that you stole from me, Sloane," Marcus said, his tone perfectly flat. "You are sorry that the audit caught you." I reviewed the bank statements. While you were funneling my money to your parents, you were also transferring thousands of dollars a month into a secret, offshore account in the Cayman Islands under your maiden name. You were preparing to leave me the moment my wealth dried up. Sloane froze, her mouth opening in a silent gasp of terror. He knew everything. The prenuptial agreement you signed, Marcus continued, explicitly states that in the event of documented financial infidelity, you forfeit any right to spousal support, alimony, or the division of shared assets. My lawyers have already filed the necessary injunctions. You will leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it. Nothing. Marcus, no, Sloane screamed, falling to her knees again, grabbing his pant leg. I'll be on the street. I don't even have a car. How am I supposed to live? I suggest you ask your parents, Marcus replied coldly, stepping out of her grasp. Though I hear they are currently facing an eviction of their own. With Marcus completely shutting her down, the toxic trio realized they had only one lifeline left. The one person in the room who possessed the capital to save them. The three of them slowly turned their attention back to me. The transformation was deeply unsettling to watch. The anger, the entitlement, the screaming, it all vanished in an instant, replaced by a desperate, cloying manipulation. They reverted to the ultimate weapon of toxic families: guilt. Grant struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the counter. He looked at me, his eyes brimming with manufactured tears. Evelyn, Grant pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. Evelyn, my little girl, please. I know we made mistakes. I know I was hard on you, but I was just trying to protect our family. I was terrified. I was a foolish, arrogant man. But we are blood. We are your family. Meredith crawled forward, clasping her hands together in front of her chest. You have a son now, Meredith cried, looking at Noah and then back at me. You understand how hard it is to be a parent. You make mistakes, but you always forgive. Please, Evelyn, look at this beautiful home you have. Look at your success. You have more money than you could ever need. You don't have to do this. You can let us stay in the house. You can share the trust. We can start over. We can be a family again. Sloane sobbed loudly from the floor. I've always been so jealous of you, Evelyn. That's why I was mean to you. I'm so sorry. I love you. You're my little sister. They were saying the words I had stayed awake for years hoping to hear. I'm sorry. We love you. We made a mistake. 14 years ago, those words would have broken me. I would have handed them the keys to my penthouse, signed over the trust, and begged for their affection. But I wasn't 17 anymore. I was a CEO, and I recognized a bad investment when I saw one. I looked at the three people kneeling and weeping in my foyer. You don't love me, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive room. You love my grandfather's money, and you love my real estate portfolio. If I had been sitting in a rented studio apartment today, struggling to feed Noah, you would have taken his signature and left me to starve without a second thought. That's not true, Grant cried. It is the absolute truth, I replied. And you want to know the hardest lesson I had to learn while I was sleeping in a laundromat with a baby in my belly? They stared at me, waiting for a lifeline that was never going to come. Blood does not give anyone the right to bankrupt your soul, I stated, the absolute finality of my decision settling over the room like a heavy iron gate. You threw me into the cold because you thought I was worthless. 14 years later, I own the roof over your heads. You are bankrupt, you are homeless, and you are no longer my problem. You vindictive, heartless bitch, Meredith suddenly screamed, the fake tears vanishing instantly as the manipulation failed. She lunged forward, her hands curling into claws. I brought you into this world. You owe me your life. I will destroy you. I will go to the press. I will tell everyone what a monster you are. I didn't flinch. I reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and opened the security application for my penthouse. I tapped the red button labeled Emergency Removal. You are trespassing, I said coldly. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy steel doors of my private elevator slid open. 4 massive, deeply intimidating building security guards stepped into my foyer. They were wearing dark suits, earpieces, and expressions of zero tolerance. Ms. Cross, the head of security, said, stepping forward. Is there a problem? These 3 individuals bypassed the lobby protocol and are currently trespassing in my home, I informed him, gesturing to my screaming mother, my weeping sister, and my utterly defeated father. They are refusing to leave. Please escort them off the premises. If they resist, call the NYPD and have them arrested for breaking and entering. Understood. The guard nodded. He gestured to his team. The guards moved forward with terrifying efficiency. They grabbed Grant by the arms, hoisting him off his feet. He didn't fight back. He simply stared blankly at the floor as they dragged him toward the elevator. Meredith thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities, cursing my name, and kicking at the guards. Two men had to physically lift her by her armpits, carrying her kicking and screaming into the steel box. Sloane scrambled to her feet, clutching her fake Birkin bag, crying hysterically as she was herded into the elevator alongside her parents. She looked back at Marcus one last time, begging him with her eyes, but Marcus had already turned his back on her, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows to admire the view. The security guard stepped back, pressing the lobby button. "Have a wonderful day, Miss Cross," the head guard said. The heavy steel doors slid shut. The screaming, the crying, and the toxic noise were instantly cut off, sealed away behind layers of soundproof metal. The elevator descended. The penthouse was silent once again. The air felt incredibly light, as if a thick, suffocating smog had finally been cleared from the room. I stood in the center of my living room, looking at the torn pieces of the $10,000 check and the heavy legal documents resting on my marble counter. Marcus turned around from the window. He let out a long, deep exhale, unbuttoning his suit jacket. "Well," Marcus said quietly, "that was arguably the most efficient corporate liquidation I have ever witnessed." I smiled faintly. "Thank you for the audit, Marcus. I couldn't have laid the trap without the financial data." "It was my absolute pleasure," Marcus replied, a genuine smile finally breaking through his stoic demeanor. "And to be perfectly honest, it was the most satisfying project of my entire career. If you'll excuse me, I have to go meet with my divorce attorneys to finalize the asset protection protocols." Marcus walked over to Noah, extending his hand. Noah shook it firmly, offering a respectful nod. "Excellent work, Mr. Reed. Your data modeling on their credit ratios was flawless. Keep studying your calculus, Noah," Marcus chuckled. "You're going to make a terrifying CEO one day." Marcus offered me a final, grateful nod, then stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, taking the last remnant of my past life with him. I was alone with my son. Noah walked over to the kitchen island. He carefully gathered up the torn pieces of the high-interest check, picked up the fake will, and tossed them all into the stainless steel trash can. Then, he picked up the true will, the document that legally secured his multi-million-dollar future, and handed it to me. He looked at me, his sharp, intelligent eyes softening just a fraction. "Their liabilities have been fully liquidated," Noah said quietly, using the financial terminology we both understood so well. I looked at my brilliant, incredible son, the child they had wanted me to throw away, the child who was now the sole heir to the empire they had desperately tried to steal. I reached out and gently rested my hand on his shoulder. "Yes, they have," I replied softly, looking out the massive windows at the sprawling, glittering skyline of the city I had conquered. "And our peace is finally debt-free." The eviction of Grant and Meredith Ellison did not happen quietly. When you spend your entire life building a fragile fortress of arrogance, the collapse is never a private affair. 2 days after my security team physically removed them from my Manhattan penthouse, the final deadline for the foreclosure on their Connecticut estate expired. They hadn't packed. Grant had spent the 48 hours frantically calling old college friends, country club associates, and distant relatives, begging for a massive, uncollateralized loan to pay off the delinquent mortgage. He pitched it as a temporary liquidity issue. But the wealthy are incredibly adept at smelling financial blood in the water. Every single call ended with a polite refusal. On Thursday morning, the local sheriff's department arrived at the massive iron gates of their property. They were accompanied by a team of contractors hired by Apex Dominion Recovery to change the locks and secure the asset. Meredith, clinging to the final shreds of her country club dignity, refused to open the door. The sheriff had to legally breach the entrance. My parents were physically escorted out of their home in full view of their wealthy, elite neighbors. They were allowed to take only what they could carry in a few suitcases. The luxury cars in the driveway were towed away by the repo men less than an hour later. They were left standing on the manicured sidewalk, surrounded by expensive luggage, with absolutely nowhere to go. They tried to reach out to the extended family, the aunts and uncles who had always treated Sloane like royalty and viewed me as a disgrace. But I had preemptively sent Marcus's forensic audit to every single member of the Ellison family. When my aunts and uncles saw the fake invoices, the stolen trust funds, and the high-interest loans, their sympathy completely vanished. Grant and Meredith were toxic assets, and the extended family immediately cut them off. Unable to secure a loan and completely excommunicated from their social circle, my parents were forced to move into a cheap, extended-stay motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. Grant, fueled by a mixture of delusion and rage, attempted to fight me in probate court. He found a desperate, bottom-tier lawyer willing to take the case on contingency, arguing that my grandfather Theodore had been of unsound mind when he drafted the true will. It was a catastrophic legal error. During the primary hearing, my corporate legal team didn't just present the true will. We presented the 14 years of fraudulent bank transfers Grant had initiated under the guise of private investigators. We presented the sworn testimony of the real investigator Theodore had hired. The judge didn't just dismiss Grant's contestation. She was utterly disgusted. She sanctioned Grant for filing a frivolous and malicious lawsuit, ordering him to pay all of my legal fees. When Grant couldn't pay, he was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, completely wiping out the last remaining fragments of his credit score. Sloane's dissent was equally brutal. Marcus executed the divorce with the same cold, terrifying precision he used in his commercial audits. Sloane attempted to play the victim in family court, crying to the judge about how her wealthy husband was abandoning her and leaving her destitute. But Marcus didn't argue with her tears. He simply submitted the forensic financial ledger. He proved that she had been embezzling marital funds. He proved that she had opened secret, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to hide money from him. He proved that she had forged his signature to take out a massive line of credit to pay off her parents' property taxes. The judge, facing irrefutable, mathematically proven financial infidelity, enforced the prenuptial agreement to the letter. Sloane was denied alimony. She was denied access to Marcus's retirement accounts. She was denied any share of the real estate properties. Stripped of her golden child status, her wealthy husband, and her designer lifestyle, Sloane was forced to move into the extended stay motel with our parents. The last update I received from a former family acquaintance was almost poetic in its tragedy. Sloane, the woman who used to mock my rental apartment while carrying a Birkin bag, is now working as a shift manager at a discount retail clothing store. Grant spends his days sitting in the motel room, bitterly watching daytime television, completely stripped of the patriarchal power he once wielded like a weapon. And Meredith, unable to show her face in her old zip code, rarely leaves the room. They are trapped in a prison of their own making, bound together not by love, but by mutual bankruptcy and a complete inability to accept responsibility for their actions. As for me, my life moved forward with an incredible, profound sense of peace. Apex Dominion Recovery expanded, acquiring 2 smaller firms and dominating the commercial liquidation market on the East Coast. My son Noah graduated high school 2 years early and was accepted into a prestigious Ivy League university, where he is studying corporate finance and estate law. We didn't just survive the blizzard they threw us into. We built an empire in the ice. I often think about that night 14 years ago. I think about the scared, freezing 17-year-old girl sitting in a laundromat, wondering if her life was over. I wish I could go back and tell her that the people who threw her away were not gods. They were just deeply flawed, deeply broken people hiding behind a facade of money. I learned the most valuable lesson of my life the hard way. Family is not defined by shared DNA. Blood does not give anyone the right to abuse you, to manipulate you, or to demand your submission. If the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones actively trying to destroy your peace, you owe them absolutely nothing. Sometimes healing doesn't look like forgiveness. Sometimes healing doesn't mean sitting around a table and talking through your feelings. Sometimes healing is auditing their lies. Sometimes healing is letting them face the full, terrifying weight of their own consequences. And sometimes healing is simply changing the locks on the penthouse door. So tell me honestly, if your family threw you out in the cold when you were at your most vulnerable, and then returned over a decade later, demanding your resources to save themselves from ruin, would you give them a second chance out of family obligation? Or would you buy the debt they owed, look them in the eye, and legally evict them from your life? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.